Hey everybody, I'm Adriana Hopkins with ABC 7 News, coming to you from Prince George's County for PGC MLS this week. And this week there's a selection of great programs designed to bring people together. Hey kids, in this Women's History Month STEM event, learn about Grace Hopper, programming, and code debugging. Then participate in a bee debugging lesson with PGC MLS on Tuesday at 3 p.m. Join the Diversity Dialogue, The Elephant We Don't See, a monthly discussion about equity, diversity, inclusion, and anti-racism. With books as a launch point, we'll be taking an in-depth look at I Am Woman by Lee Maracle this Tuesday at 7 p.m. Maryland Libraries Together is a collaboration of Maryland libraries whose goal is to engage with communities in enriching educational experiences to advance an understanding of the issues of our time. And as part of this group, PGC MLS is hosting two really important events this Thursday. First, at 5 p.m., learn the facts about the coronavirus or COVID-19 and COVID-19 vaccines from clinicians, researchers, people who have received the vaccine, and other health professionals at the COVID-19 Vaccine Information Session virtual event. Then at 7 p.m., leading and award-winning contemporary Latin American writers gather to discuss their perspectives on the importance of own voices narratives and providing representation for readers at the Viva Latino Own Voices Writers and Conversation event. Learn the basics of 3D design tools this Friday at noon during STEM at Home, The World in 3D. Kids can follow along at tinkercad.com to create a model of a house using basic geometric shapes. And they'll also learn how to send their designs to PGC MLS to have them printed on the library's 3D printers. It is never too early to expose your children to the beauty of the Spanish language. With your library card, log on to PGC MLS's digital resource, Make Make, today for free. You'll gain access to over 600 authentic fiction and nonfiction Latin American books for all school ages. These include about 100 animated books for your young children. Thanks for watching PGC MLS this week, and be sure to take advantage of all of the free resources available to you at pgcmls.info. Have a great week, and we'll see you next week.
Good evening and welcome to the Prince George's County Memorial Library System's virtual programs. My name is Nicholas Brown. I'm the Chief Operating Officer for Communication and Outreach. We are so thrilled to welcome you on behalf of the library as well as our wonderful partner agency, the Prince George's County Human Relations Commission, which is our local civil rights enforcement and education agency. A special shout out to Renee Battlebrooks, their Executive Director, and Kyla Hannington, their Outreach Coordinator, for working with the library on many, many events. Tonight's program is part of our ongoing series called Voting Democracy in Action. And throughout this series, we've looked at different topics ranging from how to actually participate in the 2020 presidential election during a pandemic to the issues of identity and how they inform and create challenges for folks in terms of voter engagement, as well as looking at the impact of policies and the results of elections on influencing those policies when it comes to cultural groups here in the United States. We are so thrilled to be presenting tonight's event in association with Maryland Humanities. This program is part of the Maryland Humanities Voices and Votes Electoral Engagement Project, which we've been working with since January, and we're really grateful to them for their support. It's part of a larger initiative called Why It Matters, Civic and Electoral Participation, which is a series administered by the Federation of State Humanities Councils and funded by the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. Tonight is a very important program because we're going to be getting into some topics that aren't necessarily immediately at the ballot box all the time, though what happens at the ballot box has tremendous implications on people's lives on a daily basis. And this is really current events happening in our country with the rise of racism against Asian Americans, for example, the role of immigration in policy, and what happens in the political system as a result of those topics. We are so honored to be joined by a very distinguished community leader and human rights attorney, Azadeh Shahshashani, who serves as the Legal and Advocacy Director with Project South. She has worked for a number of years in the U.S. South to protect and defend immigrants and Muslim, Middle Eastern, and South Asian communities. She previously served as president of the National Lawyers Guild and as National Security Immigrants Rights Project Director with the ACLU of Georgia. She also serves on the Advisory Council of the American Association of Jurists and on the Board of Directors of Defending Rights and Dissent. She has had an important role internationally as a trial monitor in Turkey, as an election monitor in Venezuela and Honduras, and as a member of the jury in people's tribunals in Mexico, the Philippines, and Brazil. I really encourage all of you to check out Azadeh's very distinguished background. She's received numerous awards across disciplines. Her work is transforming people's lives on a daily basis because she's equipping us with the tools and the know-how in order to organize and to affect change in our civic society. So without further ado, I'm going to invite Azadeh on, as well as Renee Battle-Brooks, who will be leading our conversation. And again, thank you all so much for joining us.
And good evening. And thank you so much, Nick, for those introductory words. And welcome, Azadeh. We are thrilled to have you with us this evening.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm honored to be with you tonight.
I suppose if there's one good thing about COVID, it's that, we've been able to reach outside of our jurisdiction. And we know that you're coming to us from Georgia. So what part of Georgia are you in?
Based in Atlanta.
All right. And I understand the weather's a little bit rainy, or it's nice now?
Oh, definitely. It's nice now. Everything is in bloom. It's beautiful out here.
Awesome. So I always like to give sort of a backdrop foundation for those listening. So let's first talk about the organization that you are with, and that's Project South. Can you first tell us a little bit about its history from the late 80s when it was formed?
Right. So Project South was founded in 1986 in Alabama. And based on the Black radical traditions of the U.S. South. The headquarters right now are in Atlanta, and we still work with folks and with grassroots community organizations across the U.S. South, and we also have contacts in the global South, from Haiti to Philippines, whom we work with. And we work on movement building and movement support in terms of providing support specifically to communities, including Black, Brown, immigrant, refugee, and Muslim and Indigenous and Black communities also in the global South who are facing state repression.
Fascinating. So because I have lots of questions to ask about the global South, but in looking at the website, the mission and vision statement really talks about different things. But one of the things that struck me is it was talking about poverty and genocide. And could you define those two terms for us, how in terms of or through the lens of your organization and what that means in the mission?
Right. So, the various, really plagues that affect, communities of color. Maybe we're talking about COVID, for example. We saw how it impacted Black communities in, a really particular way, in a worse way, in a lot of, different ways. And so, what Project South did, for example, to confront that, was to do testing in various sites in South Atlanta, and that's where our office is based. And also, we work closely with the Georgia Coalition, Georgia Community Coalition Against Hunger. So, we are, our building is called the Mutual Aid Liberation Center. The upstairs is Project South, downstairs is the Georgia Citizens Coalition Against Hunger. And so, what we used to do was to have various events, during non-pandemic times, various community events at the building, and also, folks facing hunger would be able to come to the building and just, just be provided with the resources that they needed. Obviously, when COVID hit, that was not possible anymore. So people from Project South and Georgia Citizens Coalition Against Hunger and various other folks in the community got together. And in addition to organizing testing for COVID in various parts of South Atlanta, also just took, food and care packages to people in the community. who were being hit from, multiple fronts, either obviously, poverty, COVID, the racism, white supremacy. I mean, what we saw over the summer as well was, people's rebellion against white supremacy. And we had the murder of Rayshard Brooks in South Atlanta, very close to the offices of Project South. So, confronting all of those issues together as a community. And that's what, Project South has been doing.
So can you talk a little bit about genocide and maybe how it relates to Project South in America, United States, and perhaps the global South?
Right. I mean, really, I mean, it's about, people of color and indigenous communities. I mean, you look at the founding of this country and really, the murder and extermination of indigenous people, and then, the slavery, the legacy of slavery. So all of that very much relates to genocide. And so, those legacies, unfortunately, are at the foundation. And so, in terms of what can be done at this moment to address the legacy of injustice, and, part of what I mentioned in terms of, coming up with ways together to address the crisis that was presented by COVID, but other issues of a structural racism and white supremacy that is really targeting Black communities in particular, as well as communities of color, brown people. And so that is what some of the work entails.
Now, the one of the other things that I noticed on the website was sort of talking about this youth engagement, and that's very intriguing, youth leadership. And can you talk a little bit about, sort of broadly, why that's important and how that's achieved at Project South?
Sure. So, for one thing, centering the voices of youth is really important in our work, and ensuring that the demands of youth are heard in terms of drafting an agenda. Because, a lot of times you have, a lot of older people speaking for youth. And so in this case, wanting to make sure that youth themselves come together to draft the agenda for what is needed. So at some point we had a campaign called 10 Mil for Real, which means that, instead of $10 million going to policing, let's see how we can actually invest that money in schools, in education, and in, the real needs that youth have. You have very challenging conditions in a lot of schools in South Atlanta, for example. And so, where is the money going that should have been going to schools in South Atlanta? And so, the demands are really formed as part of the assembly, as part of the People's Assembly process, which is one of the tools that Project South and partners in the South engage in for ensuring that, the voices of everybody is heard. So people coming together as part of an assembly and deciding, what are the priorities right now, for the community, what are the needs, what are the crises that the community is facing, how do we think we could address them, and then drafting up an agenda and a set of demands. And so, providing those spaces for youth, whether it's in the, Project South building or otherwise. And I should add too that, we named the building the Mutual Aid Liberation Center a couple years ago, long before the term mutual aid, became trendy during the early days of the pandemic, because we have long felt and believed that we as community members need to be relying on each other for various areas, because everybody has a skill to contribute, whether it is, cooking or, it's legal knowledge or whatever it is, or, gardening. And so being able to rely on each other for safety and otherwise. So when there's a crisis, not automatically calling the police, rather, seeing if it can be resolved, through the community resources that we have built. And so the same is, true for youth. Youth are also part of this mutual aid liberation process in terms of, just making sure that, for one thing, youth are aware of their rights in the school setting, when coming into contact with law enforcement, but also youth contributing knowledge in terms of the skills that they have, teaching each other, and teaching, the older folks, including myself. And, I've learned a lot from youth who are active with Project South.
Yeah. So we've kind of talked now sort of the 30,000 foot level about what Project South does and how it interacts in the community. But let's now drill down a little bit more and talk about your work very specifically, what it is that you do, and maybe share a few snapshots about what it is with very specific examples, and just kind of paint this picture for us to understand.
Sure. So I serve as Legal and Advocacy Director at Project South. So I should first mention that the organization had already been in existence for 30 years, so from 1986 to 2016, as a movement building organization, chiefly engaging in organizing, community-based education and movement building before they decided that they need a lawyer. And so the model of the lawyering work is very different from, perhaps some other organizations. And, I consider myself a movement lawyer, meaning that, my work is, as a lawyer, is accountable to the movement, to the needs of the movement, and to the organizing, rather than the other way around. And so currently our focus areas are shutting down ICE prisons, also known as immigration detention centers, ending local police collaboration with ICE, ensuring that undocumented immigrants have access to fundamental rights such as the right to access utilities and higher education, as well as defending and protecting Muslim, Middle Eastern, and South Asian communities against state repression and discrimination.
So that's actually a very wide swath, right? So give us an example of a project that you're working on. Let's first of all start with the cooperation between local law enforcement and Department of Homeland Security. Let's start there. Give us an example of the project and kind of show us how this works within your organization.
Mm-hmm. So, this is a major problem in different parts of the South. There's a program called 287G, which is a very intense type of collaboration between local law enforcement and ICE. And, there are 287G agreements across the country, but they are concentrated in the South. And I distinctly remember, actually shortly after I had come to Georgia in 2007, at the time I was with the ACLU of Georgia, the director of the Georgia Latino Alliance for Human Rights came to our office and said, 287G has now started in Cobb County, one of the metro Atlanta counties. Our community members are basically disappearing off the streets and going into this jail, the Cobb jail. And then, each of these jails operated as a deportation pipeline. So the way 287G works is that, if a community member is driving to take their kids to school, to get to work, to get to the doctor, they don't have a driver's license because undocumented people cannot get driver's license in Georgia. So then they're pulled over for having a broken taillight, for sometimes it's not even clear why people are being pulled over. Some racial profiling is going on. And so then they're arrested and taken to the jail because they don't have a driver's license. And then that's when 287G kicks in. So some sheriff deputies question people about their immigration status, and if it appears that they're undocumented, they're placed in basically deportation pipelines. And so it has led really to an atmosphere of terror in immigrant communities and communities of color in 287G counties in Georgia. For one thing, if you know that, if you're undocumented or a family member is undocumented, if you are a survivor or witness to a crime, you are not likely to call law enforcement to tell them about that crime, because the next thing you know, you yourself or the family member could be placed in deportation. And this actually happens. Like, I have spoken to people in immigration detention who were survivors of domestic violence. They called the police and they ended up in deportation proceeding themselves. So, you know, people have actual facts to rely on when they have this fear. And so we have been trying to end 287G and other types of local police collusion with ICE through educational forums, through actually talking to county commissioners, talking to sheriffs, publishing reports, documenting the impact of 287G. And, you know, we've had some victories. First of all, we have been able to get 7 localities in Georgia to put into place policies limiting their collaboration with ICE, starting in 2014. And just, you know, in the past election in 2020, November 2020, we were able to displace or get rid of 2 anti-immigrant sheriffs in Cobb and Gwinnett. And it's very significant because in these counties, sheriffs ran on an anti-immigrant platform multiple times. And so this was a huge, huge, significant victory. And so the newly elected sheriffs, one of the first things that they did once they got to office was to terminate the 287G agreement.
So what are some of the opposite views? What are some of the reasons that are given for continuing 287G? So what's the other view?
Yeah, I mean, to be quite honest, other than xenophobia and white supremacy, I don't know what other reason there is. You know, remember, sheriffs are elected positions.
Right.
So, you know, in some places, you know, sheriffs may have thought that, you know, in order to get elected, I should appear as, you know, anti-immigrant and xenophobic as I can so I can get the votes. And that was unfortunately, you know, in part true up until the last elections, where people were like, no, we've had it. You know, we want elected officials who are actually committed to human rights and dignity for everybody, for all of our community members. And, you know, this has been a really explosive issue. I mean, just to give you one example, you know, Project South and the Georgia Latino Alliance for Human Rights and a couple other organizations wanted to have a forum on 287G actually at a public library in Gwinnett. And a few days before the event, we saw an email from somebody from the Tea Party of Georgia saying that, well, these people are coming and they want to speak up their mind, and they should not be allowed to. So, you know, we're going to show up armed because it's open carry in Georgia. And so that you all should do that too. And so we saw that email on a Monday. The event was going to be on a Wednesday. So we had to quickly decide whether to go ahead with the event or not. Given that we're organizers of the event, you know, we were responsible for people's safety. At the same time, I knew that, you know, if we cancel this event, then that would set a horrible precedent, because if ever we wanted to have another event in the future focusing on people's human rights, then somebody would threaten to show up armed, and that would be the end of it. So we decided to show up and we organized our own safety and security mechanisms. People still showed up armed. You know, there were 5 armed people in the room. And I should also add that all of the speakers on the panel were women of color, and 3 of us were immigrants. And so it seemed like a, you know, clear and direct threat to our freedom of speech as immigrants and as women of color. I'm very proud. Yeah, very proud that the event did happen, though. Yeah.
Yes. So it's fascinating. So if I'm hearing correctly, it actually is the rhetoric, or the opposing view is actually they're using the words of xenophobia, or it's hidden behind sort of smoke.
It's both. It's both. So, maybe some elected officials would be more careful in terms of how they, couch their support for a program like 287G, and some others are a lot more direct about the underlying reasons for their support.
Yeah. So that was a great example of sort of one of the projects you're working on. So you talked about shuttering of facilities, detention. Talk a little bit about that.
Mm-hmm. Right. So I'm sure some of you all may have heard about forced sterilizations at the Irving County Detention Center, which is an ICE prison in Georgia. The news basically got viral in September when we issued a complaint to the Department of Homeland Security Office of Inspector General based on what we were hearing from detained immigrant women. I mean, the bulk of the report was actually lack of protection for people during COVID and the fact that the facility was forcing employees with COVID to go back to work and shredding medical documents, et cetera, et cetera. But we also had included information about there based on what we were hearing from detained immigrants and a whistleblower nurse, Ms. Dawn Wooten, whom we had got into contact with about medical abuse against women's bodies, including forced sterilizations. So, somebody went in for a minor procedure. The next thing they knew, one of their fallopian tubes was removed, which led to, obviously, a sterilization for the rest of their lives.
How does this happen in the 21st century? How does this happen?
Well, it's a good question. And I mean, the really deplorable part of this also is that ICE knew that this was happening. They knew as far back as 2018, and yet they did nothing, which, I mean, the only thing that could explain this is the level of lack of care that they have for people in their custody, and also the dehumanization of Black and brown women in these ICE prisons so that, who cares what happens to them? And I mean, I have to tell you, if it were not because of the courage of the detained immigrant women and the courage of the whistleblower nurse, Ms. Dawn Wooten, and us, being able to put this complaint out to the public, there's a very good chance that to this day, women at Irving would still be sent to this doctor, and they would still be suffering violations to their bodies with, long-lasting emotional impact.
So was this a sort of a contracted facility, privately run? And do you think that some of those abuses were allowed to occur because of sort of that layer removed?
Yes, it is a huge problem. So 80% of people in ICE custody of immigrants are in prisons run by private prison corporations. Such as Core Civic, used to be called Corrections Corporation of America. Some of y'all may remember CCA. Because of their horrible record, they changed their name to Core Civic. Of course, we all know, what they're about. But when you have a private prison corporation involved, what is their primary interest, right? Is profit. Is profit making, maximizing profit. So anything that they can do to do that, so shortchanging immigrants on food, on basic healthcare, on safety and security, they will do that. And I should just give you one example. So there's a forced labor program at the Stewart Detention Center, which is another ICE prison in South Georgia that we've been trying to shut down for a long time. So it's a forced labor program, meaning that instead of hiring regularly waged employees from the community, which is, the promise that this private prison corporation gave to the county commissioners when they went down, right? It's going to bring jobs. They actually are relying on the forced labor of detained immigrants, so paying them between $1 to $4 a day for cleaning the kitchen, cleaning the bathroom. Sometimes people have not even been paid anything. And it is forced because when people have said that they don't want to participate in this work program, they have been placed in solitary confinement or have been deprived of basic necessities of life. Because guess what? It is absolutely maximizing profit for the private prison corporation.
Yeah, and I know that there is a growing movement afoot to get rid of sort of the for-profit or the privately run prisons and detention centers for that very reason. Can you drill down just a little bit more and explain, if you came upon this during your work, sort of what were the medical justifications, I put in quotes, or were there not? Was it just done? Sort of peel that back a little bit more so that the audience has a better understanding of how this abuse can happen.
Right. So, I mean, for one thing, we filed this complaint with the Department of Homeland Security Office of Inspector General because we felt that there was need for an investigation, right? An official investigation that will reveal all the motivations behind, this really horrible scheme for so long, and, who all was involved. And, we can only guess, in terms of the motivations, the justifications just varied, in terms of, the medical necessity or not. I should say that, many independent doctors and gynecologists, have come forward and said a lot of these procedures were not needed. Obviously, everybody agrees that they were intrusive. The manner that they were done was inhumane. Women were not being provided information about what was being done to their bodies. There was lack of full and informed consent. And also the number of women that this was done to. I'm co-counsel in a class action lawsuit that we filed on behalf of the survivors of medical abuse at Irving. And so we had more than 41 women submit sworn testimony in court as part of the lawsuit, including 35 survivors of medical abuse. And this is not comprehensive. It has been extremely difficult to track down, women many of whom have been deported. Mm-hmm. ICE has not been helping in this process at all. So it's been left up to the team of lawyers and advocates to try to track down people in different parts of the world. So there could be more women out there who, in these many years suffered and will not ever really have, a chance to come forward, talk about what happened to them, let alone receive a measure of redress and compensation.
Yeah, disturbing. So the third category that you talked about was sort of with Muslim and Asian and South Pacific issues. Can you give us some examples of that work and what it entails?
Well, so for many years, we were trying to repeal the Muslim ban. Sure, folks remember that was one of the first things that Trump did, as he had promised, in terms of put the Muslim ban in place, which was, discriminatory and really affecting our communities in a really horrible way, leading to, spouses being separated from each other, grandparents, aunts and uncles, a lot of good ceremony, graduations, weddings, all of that being missed, and people in need of, serious medical care not being able to access it, the damage that it had for universities, educational and research institutions, because people could not get back in, and also, some other impacts. So, for example, in January 2020, a lot of, I think it was upwards of about 240 Iranian Americans, including, U.S. citizens, people born and raised in this country, were stopped at, entries back to the country. Some of them had gone to Canada to a concert. On the way back, because of a directive given to the Border Patrol of, you all should be targeting Iranian Americans in particular, they were stopped for a number of hours and being asked, really inappropriate questions about their political and religious beliefs. And Customs and Border Protection denied that there was any type of systematic questioning or detention of people going on. And of course, there was a whistleblower. And so we all saw that there was, in fact, a directive to them to do that. And so, there were multiple lawsuits to try to overturn the Muslim ban. Unfortunately, the Supreme Court upheld it in June 2018 in a shameful decision that we hope will be struck down at some future point. But we are happy that it has now been, in fact, repealed for now. By the Biden administration. Hopefully, Congress is now working on measures to ensure that no future president would be able to put into place a measure like that. But question remains is about accountability, right? So it's great that it has now been repealed, but what happens to the pain that our communities suffered for so many years? And so I think that's still a question that needs to be looked at very closely.
That brings actually a question to mind, because now we've seen 3 different vignettes, snapshots of the type of work and fight that you are engaged in with your organization. And I imagine that not all of the community response is positive. So can you talk a little bit about sort of that and how you overcome that, not barrier, but how do you advocate and get people to see sort of the humanity? So first of all, talk about the reactions of those that are just either don't get it or not supportive or working actively against, and then sort of what does that look like, advocacy?
Right. So it's definitely challenging, just working, doing this work at any time is difficult. But, I would say particularly during the Trump era, it was very difficult because every morning you would wake up, there would be something new from Georgia, from somewhere in the South, from the federal government. So you're always in defensive mode. And then, having to deal with white supremacist groups, it's a reality that, we have to confront. And so just being concerned about our own safety. I mean, I already mentioned an example of, what we had to confront, basically armed people coming to a public event because we had dared to exercise our free speech. I mean, that was the daily reality that a lot of us were facing, and I should say continue to face. And so I think the way that we have been able to just keep on is to continue to organize, because working in isolation is awful, and I know it's been very difficult also during the pandemic, right? But as much as possible, having online gatherings. So Project South, as I mentioned, organizes the Southern Movement Assembly. And so, multiple times during the year, people used to get together in person, in the spaces, exchange thoughts and support. And so, once the pandemic started, we had to do all of that online. But it's also provided an opportunity to, have more events. And also learn from the elders. It's really important to learn from the experience of the elders, in particular Black elders, and what they had to confront, during COINTELPRO, and just other attacks by the state and by, white supremacist groups, and yet they persevered. And so, just hearing from them, it just, keeps us motivated and going, knowing that if they were able to still achieve victories despite all the threats that they were facing from multiple fronts, we surely are going to be able to do that as well.
Yeah, that's great advice and wisdom. I don't want to miss this opportunity because this is the season of Career Day, right? When we're all asked to come and talk about our careers. I loved how you said you consider yourself a movement lawyer. So let's take a side trip for a moment. First of all, tell us how did you end up in this work? And then for those who may be listening that are younger, what does it take to become a movement lawyer?
So how I ended up in this work. So I actually went to law school with the idea of becoming a human rights attorney, but the idea I had of that work was to be an international human rights lawyer exclusively and being placed somewhere in Geneva or The Hague. And so after law school, we ended up in North Carolina because of family circumstances, far away from Geneva and The Hague, and I had no connections whatsoever. So I had to kind of figure it out on my own. And then I started, seeing a large Muslim community, much to my surprise, in North Carolina. And so then this being 2004, at the height of post 9/11 crackdown on Muslim communities, I figured that there must be some type of legal program, some other type of program to address the needs of the community on the legal front. And then there was nothing. So I approached the ACLU of North Carolina with the idea for this project to do Know and Defend Your Rights workshops in various mosques and cultural centers around the state. And also put together a network of attorneys to represent folks whose rights had been denied. And then, as we were learning more about what the community was facing, working on cases of discrimination. So I was doing that work for a couple of years, then moved to Georgia in 2007 at the height of anti-immigrant crackdown. It was 2008. I remember the Georgia legislature was a very quick awakening about, what we were confronting at that point, and is still, up to today. And then in 2000, and so I started with the ACLU of Georgia at that point. And then in 2016, having been aware of the work of Project South and the community-based work that they do, I was really inspired. And so I approached them. And so have been able to work with them from the beginning. And in terms of, movement lawyering models, I would say, folks can look into the work of organizations such as the National Lawyers Guild. That was formed in 1937, defines itself as the legal arm of the movement, meaning that, we as lawyers, our role is to support and defend social justice movements. And it is the organizers who set the agenda. And as lawyers, we, figure out ways to provide support. And so we are held accountable by the movement. It's really important because a lot of times, unfortunately, you see litigators who work on a case, but without any accountability to the community, especially, litigators who are not on the ground. And so after the case is over and they leave, people on the ground, the organizers are the ones who are left to pick up the pieces. So we try to, as movement lawyers, to shift that model and to really be part of the movement, in support of the movement, and to realize that litigation is not always the best strategy. There may be other strategy that the community, other legal and advocacy strategies that the community needs and demands. And so working very closely with the community in that regard.
Yeah, that's wonderful. It's funny because when I went to law school, that was my thing as well. It was going to be international human rights, but just understanding the journeys that we all take. Yeah,
and I should add too, I've been fortunate, and thank you so much for sharing that. And, I have been fortunate to do international work with the National Lawyers Guild and also with Project South. Again, the model being different from, the savior model, which some folks might adopt. Ours is really a model of, solidarity and support for each other. So, when one of the organizations in one of the countries that we have a close relationship with calls on us for support, whether it be serving as a member of jury in a people's tribunal or as a trial observer. So I had the honor of going to Turkey in September 2018 when we were invited by an organization, which was a sister organization of the National Lawyers Guild. About 17 of their members had been arrested by Erdogan for doing the lawyering work, just rigorous advocacy for their clients. And so the lawyers in Turkey called on us to come and be there because they felt that the judges and the prosecutors, it would have a big impact on them to know that there are people, from the US or Japan or Europe or elsewhere, just, at the back of the courtroom watching. And so I was, extremely honored to be there in support.
Did it have an impact, do you think?
I believe so, even though I should say, unfortunately, the lawyers have continued to be in prison. And one of them, unfortunately, has since died. She went on a hunger strike, really, extended hunger strike. And they just let her die. But obviously, her spirit is alive with us always.
Yeah. And that's a great segue to when you talked about sort of the global South. Can you tell us a little bit about the work that your organization Project South is doing in Haiti and in the Philippines?
Sure. So, first of all, Project South has been involved in a lot of delegations. Exchanging, folks coming to the U.S. and, us going to, for example, Senegal. There was a delegation from Project South, people of African descent who went to Senegal at the invitation of one of the community-based organizations in Senegal. And that was a gathering of various organizations in different parts of Africa, and so that was a really huge moment for Project South to be there. And so we look at these delegations as an opportunity for us to learn from folks, tactics of resistance or just tactics of survival, and how people are engaged in social justice struggle in different parts of the global South. And then in terms of Philippines and Haiti, serving as a juror on people's tribunals. Myself have had the honor to do that, looking at repression by the Duterte regime, and then Haiti, stepping in when our support may be needed. Also, exchanging in delegations and continuing to just, stay engaged with each other. Even during the pandemic, we have had a quarterly webinar series. So for example, the last one was on March 8th, International Women's Day, where we got to learn and hear from women in different parts of the global South, as well as the US South, about the struggles that women are continuing to launch or continuing to engage in on a daily basis to dismantle patriarchy and basically state-supported patriarchy that we still have to confront.
Yeah, for those who are listening who may not know, can you describe what is a People's Tribunal? What's the purpose? How is it? What's the whole reason and the net effect?
Sure. And I actually just wrote an article about people's tribunals because I think it's a really powerful tool for organizing for people's movements. So I'll share that with you all, and perhaps you can get it to the audience. So the first tribunal was the Russell Tribunal, the first tribunal that we know of in this formal way, looking at the Vietnam War, because there were no judicial forum that people could talk about the human rights violations. And so since then, there have been potentially thousands of people's tribunals in different parts of the world and in the US. So for example, after Katrina, there was a people's tribunal in New Orleans looking at the criminalization of Black folks, as well as really the crimes of law enforcement against the Black residents of New Orleans, and that was a really powerful people's tribunal. In Atlanta, we had a people's tribunal when the Supreme Court delayed the hearing on the second version of the Muslim ban. We in Atlanta decided that we're going to go ahead with our own people's tribunal. So we had a jury composed of community members, and we had most important element of people's tribunal as the survivors, people who have experienced human rights violations. So community organizations and various people who had experienced separation or other pain from the Muslim ban showed up and spoke. And so after deliberation, the jury delivered a verdict of guilty against the Muslim ban and against the Trump administration for their human rights violations. And so, people's tribunals, again, serve the function of providing a forum to survivors of human rights violations. And so they also serve the purpose of documentation. So, as part of the People's Tribunal focused on the Philippines that was held in Brussels, that I was a part of a couple years ago, lawyers from the Philippines had prepared enormous amounts of evidence that they submitted to the jury. And then the verdict was delivered. And then, we took that verdict to the European Parliament, and the lawyers from the Philippines drove to The Hague, to the International Criminal Court, with the hope of presenting that evidence to the International Criminal Court for them to initiate an investigation and hopefully hold proceedings in the future against the government of Philippines. So they are indeed very important tool in organizing.
So how are jurors picked for the people's tribunals?
First of all, the jurors do not have to be lawyers. They can be, community members. I have been on tribunals where actually former judges have been members of jurors of people's tribunals as well. But it could be community leaders. So the jury in Atlanta was really a mix of people coming from representing various backgrounds. So it's really up to the organizers in terms of who to pick to serve as a juror.
Really sounds like a wonderful way to engage multiple people, to, as you said, grassroots, to have people feel that they are involved, that their voices are being heard, that, it's a wonderful model. I do want to see if I have other questions, but let's see if in the last few minutes, if Kyla or Nick, there are questions that people have that wish to ask. All right. Hearing no response at this point. So we've covered sort of a lot of ground, and it's all been rooted around, as you said, grassroots and accountability to those in the community and hearing the voices. Talk a little bit about why this is so important to democracy. Why is what you do and why is what Project South does so important to democracy?
Well, so for one thing, if you look at U.S. history, all of the important victories in the human rights and civil rights arena have been a result of people's movements, right? The civil rights movement, women's suffrage, the end to the war on Vietnam, et cetera, et cetera. Those victories happened because people poured on the streets or organized in other ways for so long, for decades. And really pushed and forced politicians to take action. And so, it was organizing, it was long-term organizing that made those sustainable victories last. And so, that is our theory of change, that, in order to make sustainable change happen for social justice, we have got to engage in movement building. So voting is definitely important. I already mentioned one instance in which, we ended 287G in Cobb and Gwinnett through voting as one of the mechanisms. But, we had been engaging in organizing and education and movement building against 287G for a long time. And so, the voting was part of it. And so that is... and I'm going to share another article also in the chat that hopefully can be shared with the participants in terms of, how, through engaging and through building really strong social justice movements, independent really of, what is happening on the political party front. That is how we can, achieve long-term social change. And I also have a word for participants, please do not be complacent, right? The Trump era is over, but as we have seen, atrocities have continued. We just had the murder of folks in Atlanta, Asian Americans and other folks. And so, other types of human rights violations are continuing. People are dying in detention centers. And so the last thing that we can afford right now is to be silent and complacent because Trump is not in office anymore, which, we all are celebrating that. But, we can't stay silent. We can't afford to because, no politician has done anything out of their own volition or out of their own goodwill. They do things because the people force them to. And so please continue to raise your voices, hold your elected officials accountable, members of Congress and other elected officials. And so for one thing, we really need your help in shutting down the Irving County Detention Center, because members of Congress were saying a lot of good things about shutting down Irving, and it's a horror show, and we got to end these atrocities, and that was great. But they were speaking out during the Trump era. I haven't really heard much about about the violations in detention centers from them, under Biden, even though as I said, people are still dying in detention. So please pay attention to what is happening and follow the lead of your local grassroots organizations in terms of the issues to pay attention to, whether it's voting rights. Obviously, we just had the Georgia governor sign into law a really atrocious measure, voter suppression measure, really aimed to uphold white supremacy. I mean, it was awful. So, pay attention to voting rights, immigrants' rights, women's rights, and other issues, and continue to be engaged.
So I think you pretty much answered the question. And the question was, why is it important for the public to pay close attention to local policies, politics with regards to those broader issues? And you've answered. And I think, just to wrap it up, it really is all of our responsibility to have the type of society that we as the people wish, what we decide is acceptable. And so engagement is really the only way that we can. And that's, the history of our country was grassroots involvement and change, and not leaving it to, quote, the elite or the educated or whoever it was in the hierarchy, that we in this country have equal voice. And I'll just close with one thing before Kyla comes on and does the closing. I think the saying was, if you're not a citizen or you're not of age to vote, you can affect that vote by working and influencing 8 or 10 other people who do have the vote. And so we all have a responsibility to remain engaged and to stay engaged and in tune with everything that is happening around us, because we should decide what we believe is acceptable in the places that we work, live, and play. So thank you so much, Azadeh, for spending this time with us, sharing a little bit about Project South and how it relates really to democracy in the larger vein, and just giving us a snapshot of local movements and why it's important. So thank you. And with that, we're going to invite Kyla back.
All right, thank you very much. Thank you to both of you for this important conversation. Thank you, Azadeh, for your time and energy and being with us this evening, and for all the work that you do. Thank you, Renee, for moderating. And thank you, as always, to our friends, PGC MLS, for partnering with us for this and so many other events, and particularly Nick, who's a wonderful event partner and is the person who is running the show behind scenes this evening. We also want to thank Maryland Humanities for their support for our Voting, Democracy, and Action series, including this one this evening. And to all of you who have tuned in, thank you so much for joining us. I want to take a moment to acknowledge that today is the International Transgender Day of Visibility, in which we honor transgender folks throughout history for their contributions, their courage, and their humanity. We have more great programming coming up, and I particularly want to highlight just a couple of events that are happening tomorrow. First, at 5 o'clock, the library system is holding a COVID vaccine info event, and I'm hoping Nick will be putting links to that for you in the chat where you're watching. And at 7 p.m., we will have leading contemporary Latin American writers gather to discuss their perspectives on the importance of own voices narratives in providing representation for readers. And this will be part of Maryland Libraries Together Viva Latino Own Voices Writer in Conversation event. And that's at 7. And again, those links should be up in the chats. And you can also go to the library's YouTube page, PGC MLS, and see all of their upcoming, those events tomorrow, and then also what has happened historically. And feel free to check out pgcmls.info/events to see what's coming up. And you can also check out our events page at tinyurl.com, PGCHRC events. You can follow the library on all social media platforms at PGCMLS, and you can follow us, the Human Relations Commission, on Twitter at HRCPG County. Again, thank you everyone for joining us this evening, and good night.
Thank you.